Thanks, Doug. Lovely to see you. As I look out, I see some familiar faces that have been looking back at me on some previous days and others I don't recognize. And whether this is your first or return, big question. I hope you're really welcome. I remember a few months ago I was doing an event similar to this at Leeds University at lunchtime, and one guy came up to me afterwards and had a real moment of lucidity and honesty. I remember him looking me in the eye and saying, look, if I'm honest, my objection to Christianity isn't on the ground of its truth claims. It's not on the grounds of thinking that Jesus couldn't come through on his claims. It's just that I think that following Jesus will rob me of life. And my guess is that if we're honest in the depth of our hearts, that sort of sentiment may be true for quite a number of people here. It's not Christianity's truth claims that ultimately move you away from embracing Christianity. It's the assumption that if you follow Jesus, you'll be prevented from being who you really are. I guess many of us are worried, and certainly this was one of my concerns earlier on in my life, that if I take following this Jesus guy seriously enough, I'm just going to find myself tied up in a whole load of thou shalt nots, where the good times of life evaporate and the marrow is sucked out of life, that we'll lose our freedom. Freedom is one of those evocative words, isn't it? Perhaps you think of Mel Gibson's character, William Wallace in Braveheart. I will not attempt to do the accent. You'll be pleased to hear. Make a worse job even than him. But here's the speech. Fight and you may die. Run and you will live at least a while. But dying on your bed many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here as young men and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they will never take our freedom? Perhaps you think about the way in which freedom is celebrated in popular culture in quite the way it is. Freddie Mercury sang that he wanted to break free. The Beatles sang about being free as a bird, my own favorite, and Nina Simone, I wish that I knew how it would feel to be free. All of us want freedom. Who would put their hand up to say, oh yeah, I'd just like to be a little bit less free? Freedom is such an evocative word, and so the fear of our freedom being limited or taken away can be paralyzing. What we often skip over, though, I think, is this question, and it may seem obvious to you, but what is freedom? What is freedom? What does it mean to be free? What is this freedom that we so desire? See, if we're to understand the imperatives of Christianity correctly and to consider whether or not Christianity might rob us of our freedom, then this prior question of the nature of freedom needs to be considered first. Now, if you have been brought up in the West, and that's not everybody here, but it's quite a number of us here, we tend to think of freedom as freedom from something. Freedom from some kind of power that has the possibility to inhibit or restrict us from our true potential, or maybe being able to do what we want. John Stuart Mill is the sort of founding father of this sort of idea of freedom. He defined freedom in this way in his little treatise on liberty. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. In other words, you see what Mill is saying freedom is? It's the ability to do whatever you want, whenever you want. And therefore to be free is to be free from anything that might stop you from doing whatever you want, whenever you want. Now, this view of freedom is absolutely the view which is the most significant over Western culture. Taylor Swift, the ironic favorite, I know, of many a person here, espouses just that view. Where does freedom lie, according to Taylor Swift? In shaking off the words of the players and the haters, the heartbreakers and the fakers. What's freedom according to Taylor Swift? It's being free from those who might constrain you from criticizing what you want to do. And so she's going to keep cruising. She can't stop. She won't stop. Grooving. That's where freedom lies, according to Taylor Swift, or the other philosophers of our age. Perhaps this will float your boats a little more. One Direction. Let's go crazy, crazy, crazy till we see the sun. I know we only met, but let's pretend it's love. And never, never, never stop for anyone. Tonight, let's get some. And live while we're young. What is freedom, according to One Direction? It means getting some. And not letting anyone get in the way of what you want. Do you see the common thread? Freedom is the ability to do whatever you want, whenever you want, and just shaking off anyone who might get in the way. Now, there is something quite attractive about this freedom. And it does tell a partial truth. In that many of us will know that we can be constrained by the false opinions of others about us. However, let me also suggest there is something deeply, deeply, deeply deficient about this view of freedom if it's your primary way of thinking about it in this way. And the unattractiveness of this view of freedom alone is that it can't ever positively give you an identity. See, according to this view, freedom is all about flourishing, being truly me. But according to this view of freedom, where it just encourages me to do what I want, whenever I want, and to shake off whoever might criticize me, this view does not, and it cannot tell me who the authentic me is. It just says, don't let anybody tell you who you are. In fact, it's even stronger than this. In order to be true to itself, this view of freedom that we've outlined so far must refuse to tell you who you truly are. After all, this brand of freedom can't interfere. It's got to be able to be shaken off. All it can do is provide a sphere where you can do whatever you want, whenever you want, but it cannot and it will not comment on whether or not this activity is good for you, whether or not it will cause you to flourish, and whether or not it's actually authentic to the real you. From One Direction to somebody quite different. In her classic history, The Echo of Greece, historian Edith Hamilton captures something of this paradox. When she describes the decline of the Greek Empire, she writes this. This is so perceptive. When the freedom they wished for most was freedom from responsibility, then Athens ceased to be free and was never free again. Do you see what she's saying? She's saying, when you only value freedom from, then you run the risk of embracing something dangerous. Because unrestrained thought and unrestrained behavior aren't necessarily beneficial. And yet the let's go crazy, crazy, crazy view of freedom takes away all checks and balances. And in fact, this view of freedom prevents anybody from getting too close to you or criticizing you because they're a potential threat who might stop you from doing what you want whenever you want. It repels all claims upon you and leaves you as an individual with absolute and unquestioned autonomy and independence over your life. Yes, you are left with the ability to do whatever you want, whenever you want, but when you've shaken off the opinions of everybody else, this view of freedom leaves you as an individual and you only with every single decision about whether or not what you're doing is truly wise and will lead to your flourishing and to the flourishing of others. You as an individual have got to figure this out by yourself. Back in the ancient history of the 1990s, before some of you may even have been born, there was this band called Oasis. Some of you may have heard of them. And on my guilty pleasure radio station, Absolute Radio 90s, I recently heard Oasis's excellent single, Whatever, not on an album. You don't hear it very often. And it opens with these lyrics. I'm free to be whatever I choose, and I'll sing the blues if I want. There is Oasis' take on freedom. Be whoever you want. Do whatever you want. But I guess if the Gallagher brothers were being authentic to the philosophy of their song, and you went and asked a Gallagher brother, hey, Mr. Gallagher, who am I? Then what possible answer could they give you other than, be who you want to be? Be who you want to be. Doesn't that advice chime in with the advice given to millions of men and women in the Western world today? Be who you want to be. Don't let anyone tell you what to do. You are your own man. You are your own woman. Shake it off. Now, aside from the obvious contradiction here, don't let anyone tell you what to do except me. Notice how you are to be directed in life. You are to direct yourself. Why? Because you belong to yourself. And do you just notice how this sort of thinking makes your entire universe all about you? There's no reference to anyone else in the universe at all. And so I want to suggest there is something missing in all this talk about freedom so far. But it is a pretty key ingredient that's missing, and it's this. The environment in which we find ourselves and in which we exercise our freedom. For a start, it includes everybody else in the universe. Most of what is said in pop philosophy about freedom today considers only what it means for us as individuals, because we're following John Stuart Mill. And yet human existence is never atomistic and alone. If we're on guilty pleasures today, here's a guilty pleasure film about a boy. The main character, played by Hugh Grant, rejects the premise at the beginning of the film that no man is an island. He claims that he is an island. In fact, you might remember he claims to be Ibiza. But the point of the film actually is to refute this basic claim, that human life is built on a network of interdependent relationships, that none of us does live as an island. We all live our lives within the context of relationships. And part of what it means to be a human animal is to be a social animal. And therefore, whatever freedom is, it's surely got to pay more attention to the social environment in which we live. One of my heroes is a man who knew a thing or two about freedom, Nelson Mandela. He put it like this: to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. And so here's the point. If we think about freedom in merely this sort of atomistic, individualistic way and divorce ourselves from our environment, including our social environment, our exercise of so-called freedom can actually take us away from our true selves, and we run the risk of hurting others in the process too. And so I want to suggest this lunchtime we need a completely different way of thinking about freedom. I want to suggest this lunchtime that freedom is not primarily doing whatever you want, whenever you want, but that true freedom is found on an entirely different footing. A whale is free in the ocean. An eagle is free when it soars in the sky. These animals are not free in each other's environments. A little thought experiment shows that, doesn't it? Can you imagine launching a beached whale off the top of a mountain, sort of forcing an eagle down under the water? The RSPCA would soon be involved, wouldn't they? And that's because these animals are free in their own environments. May I suggest it's the same true for us as well? We don't exist as free-floating individuals to whom the greatest gift is individual autonomy. Rather, we are truly free when we properly relate to the environment in which our personhood flourishes. And that's why when the Bible talks about freedom, it speaks of the capacity to be truly yourself in the context of the relational environment that you live in. Relationships not only with every other human being in the universe, but also the God who made you and who loves you. And the Bible will say until you experience freedom in this context, you may make all sorts of decisions and choices. You may be whoever you want. You may do whatever you want. But you'll never be truly yourself. You'll never be truly free. We see that a bit, don't we, in the context of romantic relationships. In some sense, when you enter into a serious relationship with someone, you surrender aspects of your freedom. Particularly when people marry, they surrender all sorts of freedoms, including the freedom to look elsewhere for partners, but a number of other freedoms as well. For example, when I got married, I surrendered certain freedoms. The freedom to enjoy coriander in curry, the freedom to eat bananas in public, the freedom to, I know, my wife just finds them really creepy. The freedom to listen to the Eagles and certain forms of American rock music. And at one level you'd say, why on earth have you decided to get married to this woman when there is so much freedom that you have to surrender? You know, there are certain things you can't do whenever you want, however you want. You might shake me and say, what about the coriander? But doesn't that kind of miss the point? In a good relationship, don't both parties willingly give things up and yet find themselves to be freer in that context as they sacrifice for one another and live for one another? In fact, this is always how freedom works. Think of the dancer or the musician who seem so free when they perform. The truth is that they are only free in that environment because they've sacrificed all sorts of other freedoms in order to be able to achieve this freedom. I think of Olympic athletes. Some of us heard Debbie Flood speaking on Tuesday, who has surrendered so much for so many years of her life in order to make rowing look so free on the water. And so the question comes, how do we best experience flourishing? How do we best experience freedom? And what is worth sacrificing in order to know it? At one point, as Jesus outlined his mission statement, he used the language of freedom. He says this, he, God the Father that is, has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free. I know Jesus doesn't have this reputation in our culture, but Jesus claimed that he was all about bringing freedom. And he claimed he was going to do that through doing absolutely everything that was necessary in order to bring us back into relationship with the God who made us and the God who loves us. Jesus says that is where you are truly free, and it is worth letting go of other things. In fact, it's worth letting go of anything to be in that relationship. Because according to Jesus, as a human in God's universe, that is where you are truly free. At one point, Jesus told a story about two sons, and one son goes off to try and find freedom in a foreign country. Goes off to do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, to be whatever he wants. He lives the high life with wine and women and food. But as some of us will know, this kind of freedom doesn't eventually provide the sort of life that we were hoping it would deliver. And this son ends up eventually feeding pigs, penniless. That's where his pursuit of freedom eventually takes him. And the son heads for home, and he sort of makes a pact with himself to work for his father, to slave away as an employee for the rest of his life. But just listen to what Jesus says next. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. The son said, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger. Put sandals on his feet. Let's kill the fattened calf. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now is found. Now, do you see Jesus' point here? Here is the Son, and now, at last, Jesus is saying, he is experiencing the kind of freedom to be himself that he never had in the far country. Because he's freest as a child, with nothing left to prove, in the arms of the Father who deeply loves him. That's where his freedom resonates with reality. Jesus says this Son is a picture of any of us who tries to carve out freedom for ourselves. And Jesus also says that the Father in this story is a picture of God himself. And so just listen to the verbs that Jesus used to describe God as he sees those returning on the horizon. He runs, he hugs, he kisses, he robes, he celebrates. That's the God that Jesus claimed to reveal in word and in action. And in his arms, says Jesus, you can be free. And let me say, if God truly is like this, if God is more like this than the caricature God that you've carried around with you up until this point, aren't you caused to think again? The restrictions that might seem so dated and arbitrary and restrictive, if they come from this kind of God, could it be that they're actually for your flourishing and for your good? Both for you as an individual and for your place in a community. And so Jesus insists that we will never know freedom until we resonate in the environment that we were created to live in. And that means then including not only other people in our thinking, but also God. That true freedom comes as we satisfy ourselves in his love for us. That we love him first above all, and we pour out our lives in service of others. That is where you are truly free. The Gospels reassure us that Jesus has done everything through his death on the cross so that you might know that tightest of family relationships with the God who is love, a life of freedom, being exactly sure of where you stand. And that's because Jesus, eternally free, eternally in relationship with his Father, put himself under shackle at the cross for us, separated from his Father, in order that we might be made free. The Bible says, look to the cross and you will know that God himself buys your freedom at the very most costly of prices. So then, as free people, Christians like me don't seek to live differently in order to earn God's forgiveness, but because we want to grow in our relationship with our Heavenly Father. We want to love what he loves. We don't obey in order to be forgiven. We obey because we're forgiven. And so I want to suggest then that true freedom is not primarily found in doing what you want when you want, but to be satisfied by God's costly love for you, knowing that it's enough, knowing that he is for us, and that even the most countercultural of his commands for us are ultimately for our flourishing, that he knows us better than we even know ourselves. There's one account where before he became president, Abraham Lincoln was at a slave auction, and a young girl was being sold there naked but for her shackles. And Lincoln was so distressed at the idea of her being bought by one of the rabble that he bid for her himself, and as the price went up and up and up, Lincoln continued to outbid the rest until he paid a vast amount of money for her. The story is told of how the girl is brought to Lincoln, petrified of what a white man who is willing to pay so much for her might want to do with her. She walked up to Lincoln. Lincoln stooped down, took off his great black cloak, placed it around her with these words, "You're free." The girl couldn't believe it. She said, "You mean I can go wherever I want?" He said, "Yes." "I can marry whoever I want?" "Yes." "I can go wherever I like?" "Yes." "I can work wherever I like?" "Yes." Then she said to Lincoln, "I choose to go with you." See, the goodness of that slave girl's new master caused her to want to belong to him. If we interviewed her, would she say she was missing out on life? No, I think she would have said that she was free. Freer than she might have been through making any number of decisions and choices that might have led her elsewhere. Free in an environment that she knew was for her flourishing, because she trusted the heart of her master. Today, I want to just pose the idea that belonging to the one true God, revealed in Jesus, who is like this, who buys our freedom at such a high price, is greater even than the freedom of being whoever we want, doing whatever we want, whenever we want. And today I want to suggest that being in relationship with this God, we find the freedom that each of our hearts yearns for. Doug.
Great, thanks very much, Pete. Still do, whilst we're taking questions, text in more. We'll try and get through as many of them as we can. The first one is, most people that hold a secular morality would agree that we should have both rights and responsibilities. Is it not possible to have both freedom and responsibilities without Christianity?
Yeah, I'm certain that's true. Even though the model that we've built our freedom upon traces back to John Stuart Mill and others, of course we feel responsibility for others. That doesn't necessarily flow out very naturally of the philosophy of freedom that we see in the world today, but there are other things that are said there as well. It is true that as we thought about on Monday, on the first day, that the reason for seeking to have concern for others doesn't flow out very naturally from an atheistic worldview, particularly when it comes to intrinsic human dignity. So if you're an atheist here today, what is it that gives another human dignity and value? Is it just that they're valuable because you say they're valuable or society says they're valuable? Or is it actually that you have a responsibility to them because they truly are valuable? Now, if you are to say the second of those, then in some way you need to locate ultimate human value in something other than humanity, because you've created that as part of humanity yourself. We need to look to something outside of humanity which says that every human being is worthy of dignity and value. And that only comes when we look to something transcendent. And so the dignity and value of other human beings and the freedom in serving them before ourselves flows out very naturally from a Christian worldview. I want to suggest that it's a lot more cumbersome out of an atheistic worldview, and in fact there's tension there as well when it comes to the question, well, why should I value someone else? Why should I value someone else? When is it worth surrendering my own freedoms and sacrificing in order to show responsibility to others? So they'd be great questions to consider if you're coming from an atheistic worldview today.
Great, thanks. A couple of questions on this theme. Next is, why does God want to give us things which he has surely given us to enjoy? Why has God want us to give up things which he has surely given us to enjoy?
Okay, so why has God given us things
Which he then wants to give us up,
which he wants us to give up? Right, okay, fine. Okay. I think I want to say two things on that. Firstly, you'll know that, we probably know that different worldviews and philosophies have different things to say about desire, and whether or not desire is a positive thing. If you are a Buddhist, or if you meet a Buddhist, then you've not really got any time for desire. According to Buddhism, desire is the problem, okay? And it's through desiring too much that suffering is caused in the world today. That's one of the 8 Noble Truths of Buddhism. And And so the ultimate alleviation to suffering, according to Buddhism, is to stop desiring. Now, I think a lot of people think that that's what Christianity is saying, okay, that we just need to stop desiring and that God is asking us to stop desiring. That's not quite, well, it's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible would say two things. First is, and C.S. Lewis very famously said this, he said, when it comes to living, it's not a case that our desires are too strong, but our desires are too weak. C.S. Lewis says, when it comes to desires, we think we know what we want. And he says it's a bit like making mud pies in a slum when actually there's an invitation to a beach holiday. And so that's a helpful way of thinking, okay? It's not that our desires are necessarily too strong, we have to deny them. It's that our desires are too weak and that there is fulfillment elsewhere, ultimately, as we've seen in relationship with him. The other thing that the Bible will say is that we were created with desires that were in perfect harmony with ourselves and with our environment. And that still today we all have good desires, and yet in a way we can sort of twist these desires. Okay? The desire in itself is not bad, but I do something with this desire which makes it ugly. So, the desire for money actually in and of itself isn't a bad thing, the Bible will say. But actually when I make that good desire into an ultimate desire, I twist it and I make it into something which dehumanizes me and causes me to dehumanize others as well. Now, the desire to have things, according to the Bible, isn't wrong. In fact, there are good reasons for wanting things in order potentially to be able to give them away to others. But when I take this desire and I twist it, it's taking something that God has given me which is good, and I've made it into something which actually isn't for my flourishing. If that's quite an abstract answer. If that was your question, do come and chat to me afterwards, because it may be with some more concrete examples we can press home that in a bit more clarity.
Again, following on a major theme on the questions on the text, and in response to that one, doesn't Christianity suppress my sexual desires and my sexuality?
I mean, look, there is no doubt, there is absolutely no doubt that the Bible's blueprint for sexual relationships is completely countercultural. Regardless of your sexual orientation, regardless of whether you are male or female, I'm not going to pretend that the Bible's teaching on sexuality is one that resonates with our broader culture. And speaking as a Christian, both as a single person and as a married person, there are ways and times in which it is very hard to ultimately submit my sexual desire to God. Now, a couple of things help me here. One is the kind of master that my God is. When I look at the cross, when I look at Jesus, this doesn't appear to me to be a master, a God, who is all about ruining my life, getting me under the thumb and sucking the marrow away. I just find it impossible to believe that Jesus is anything other than for me, because ultimately of what he gave for me at the cross. Abraham Lincoln gave a lot for that slave girl. According to the Bible, Jesus has given much, much, much more for each of us. And so I believe he's for me. I believe he's for me even when it doesn't feel like he's for me. And ultimately, I believe he's for me because I believe he knows me better than I know myself. And so in my sex life, but in a whole number of other areas of life, I submit to him, not in order to obey, to achieve forgiveness from him, but because I believe he's demonstrated such a deep quality of love for me And because I love him, that I'll submit my life to him, even when it feels painful to me. Let me say one further thing, and that's this. When it comes to times like this, this reminds me that almost certainly God is not a psychological invention of my mind. If I had a God who was merely a psychological projection, basically he would tick the box and tell me that I could do whatever I want, whenever I want, and I probably best knew myself. But actually, as a God who speaks outside of my existence, outside of 21st century liberal societies like ours, outside of all cultures, we see that he both confronts and comforts those who seek to live for him as he demonstrates his love for us and calls us to live in a way that leads to our flourishing, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time.
Thanks very much, Pete. I make that about 10 to, so we'll just end there. But before you go, got a couple of things, including, I think someone dropped a necklace on the stairs, a little green dragon. If that's yours, just come see me at the end. A few more things, though. If you take into your hand the dinner plate size comment card and the pen, it'd be really helpful, even if this is your 10th time coming to these events, if you were to fill that in. I've filled it in. Look, Doug Hampshire, Van Milder comments, great presenting. But if you have been struck by anything that's been said today, please do tick the box at the bottom. I'd like to be contacted about Jesus and Christianity, local churches, any of that. We will be in touch and we'd love to do so. Secondly, after this week, you've probably been aware that this week's called This Is Life. Next week, we're running some follow-up courses, and they're on the business card size piece of paper in the Riverside Cafe at 7:30 on Mondays. Please do ask the friend that brought you, or come and ask me if you want more information about those. And just before we end, 3 more talks. That's it in This Is Life. One this evening over cake and cookies. What am I worth? That's at Christchurch Claypath. And just as we end, if anything you've heard today has wanted you to find out more about the Jesus which Pete has spoken about, I'd encourage you to take away the John's Gospels on your seats. They're free. Please do take it away. Read the biographical account of Jesus and see what you think for yourself. But thanks very much for coming. We've got another one of these tomorrow, same time, same place, with a lunch. It'd be great to see you there. Thank you.